They found it half buried in the mud of a Philippine rice paddy, its tail twisted like broken fingers reaching toward the sky. The Japanese bomber had been there for 3 days before anyone dared approach it. Local villagers said they heard the engine screaming that night, a sound like metal tearing itself apart, then silence. When American engineers finally cut through the fuselage in March of 1942, they expected to find bodies, maps, maybe intelligence that could turn the tide of a war we were already losing. What they found instead would shake the Pentagon to its core and reveal a betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. I've spent 15 years studying what we now call the Mitsubishi Paradox. The official reports were buried. Witnesses were scattered across 3 continents. But the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's written in metal and oil, and the blood of young men who died not knowing they were killed by their own country's greed. The lead engineer's name was Captain Robert Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American who'd grown up in his father's machine shop in San Francisco. He knew aircraft the way some men know scripture. When his team pried open the engine cowling that humid afternoon, mosquitoes swarming around their faces, Chen noticed something immediately wrong. The engine mountings weren't Japanese. The fuel lines had American threading. And stamped into the crankcase, partially filed away but still visible under the tropical grime, were 3 letters that made his hand start shaking. PWA, Pratt & Whitney Aircraft. The other engineers gathered around. Nobody spoke. They could hear the jungle breathing around them, the distant roll of artillery from the mountains. One of the men, a kid from Ohio named Miller, whispered what they were all thinking. That's ours. That's American. Chen ordered them to strip the aircraft completely. They worked through the night by lamplight, cataloging every component, every serial number they could find. The propeller hubs came from Hamilton Standard in Connecticut. The hydraulic systems bore markings from Bendix Corporation. The spark plugs, the wiring, the instrument panel glass. Piece by piece, they documented an impossible truth. This Japanese bomber, which had likely killed American soldiers, which had dropped bombs on American positions, had been built with American parts. But it was deeper than that. As they dug through the wreckage, they found something that turned Chen's stomach. A maintenance log tucked into a metal box behind the pilot's seat. It was written in Japanese, but the dates were clear. The aircraft had been assembled in 1938. And according to shipping manifests they would later uncover, these weren't black market parts or stolen technology. They were legal exports, sold by American corporations to Japanese buyers in broad daylight with the full knowledge and approval of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Chen sat on the torn wing that night, smoking a cigarette he didn't remember lighting. Around him, his team moved like ghosts, their faces hollow in the lamplight. They'd all lost friends in the months since Pearl Harbor. Miller's brother had died on the Arizona. Another engineer, Kowalski, had a cousin who had been at Bataan. And now they knew that American companies had armed the enemy. Not in secret, not in shame, but for profit, year after year, right up until the day the bombs started falling. The problem was older than the war itself. Throughout the 1930s, while Japan invaded China and began its imperial expansion, American corporations sold them everything they needed to build a modern air force: steel, aviation fuel, machine tools, complete aircraft engines. The Japanese military didn't just buy our parts. They studied them, reverse-engineered them, improved them. We gave them the blueprint for their own destruction of us, and we did it with a smile and an invoice. Chen filed his report through proper channels. It went up the chain of command, stamped classified at every level. He was told, politely but firmly, to forget what he'd found. The war effort required unity. American morale couldn't handle the truth that corporations had valued profits over national security. That the same companies now making weapons to fight Japan had just months earlier been arming them. But Chen couldn't forget. None of them could, because 3 weeks after they found that bomber, Japanese Zeros attacked their position. The engine sounded familiar, and when one of them crashed close enough for Chen to reach it before the fire consumed everything, he found what he already knew he would find: more American parts. more proof that we'd built the machine that was killing us. The question that haunted him, that haunts me still, wasn't just about corporate greed or government blindness. It was simpler and darker than that. How many American soldiers had died looking up at planes powered by American engines? How many last breaths were taken under the shadow of metal we'd forged and sold? And how many men in boardrooms and government offices knew the truth and decided that some profits were worth any price? The answer to that last question would come, but not for decades. And it would be worse than anyone imagined.
The paper trail led back to a Manhattan office building, 12 floors of marble and mahogany, where men in expensive suits made decisions that would echo across the Pacific like thunder. This is where the story gets darker, where patriotism and capitalism twisted together into something neither, but worse than both. Because what Captain Chan discovered in that Philippine rice paddy wasn't an accident or an oversight, it was a system. Between 1933 and 1940, American corporations exported over $550 million worth of war materials to Japan. That's roughly $12 billion in today's money. The list reads like a who's who of American industry. Standard Oil sold them petroleum products that would fuel their invasion of China. General Electric provided the technology for aircraft instruments. Douglas Aircraft Corporation, the same company building bombers for the U.S. Army Air Corps, sold Japan everything from complete aircraft designs to the machinery needed to manufacture them domestically. But Pratt & Whitney was the crown jewel of this devil's bargain. They sold Japan hundreds of powerful radial engines and, more importantly, the licensing rights to build them. The Japanese took those designs and created engines that powered the Mitsubishi A6M0, the Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber that struck Pearl Harbor, and countless other aircraft that would dominate Pacific skies in the war's early years. We literally sold them the means to attack us, then acted shocked when they used it. The justification was always the same. It was legal. It was business. Japan was a trading partner, not yet an enemy. And besides, if American companies didn't sell to them, British or German companies would. The invisible hand of the market, they called it, as if economics were a force of nature rather than a choice made by men who knew exactly what they were doing. Chen spent months trying to get someone to care. He wrote letters to congressmen, contacted journalists, compiled evidence that should have sparked investigations and indictments. But 1942 was the wrong year for uncomfortable truths. The country needed heroes, not complicated questions about who'd really profited from the road to war. His reports were filed away. His phone calls went unreturned. And eventually, quietly, he was transferred to a desk job in California, far from the front lines and the evidence that might remind people of what he'd found. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. After the war, when investigators began piecing together how Japan had modernized its military so rapidly, the truth started leaking out. Congressional hearings in the 1950s revealed the scope of pre-war trade. Declassified documents showed that State Department officials had warned repeatedly that Japan was using American technology for military purposes. Corporate executives had been briefed. Government oversight existed, and yet the exports continued right up until the day Pearl Harbor burned. Nobody went to jail. A few executives testified before Congress, expressed regret, blamed the fog of pre-war politics. The corporations paid no fines, faced no meaningful consequences. Many of them received government contracts during the war to build the very weapons we needed to fight the planes we'd helped Japan build. They profited coming and going, Alpha and Omega, merchants of a kind of death that wore a suit and tie and called itself free enterprise. Chen never spoke publicly about what he found. He died in 1987, his military records still partially classified, his story known only to a few historians willing to dig through archives that nobody wanted examined too closely. But before he died, he gave an interview to a graduate student researching pre-war trade policy. The tape sat in a university library for decades, until I found it 3 years ago. His voice on that recording is quiet, measured, the voice of a man who'd carried a weight for 40 years. He talks about the bomber in the rice paddy, about the Pratt & Whitney logo staring at him like an accusation, and then he says something that stayed with me ever since. We always talk about the warriors and the heroes, but wars aren't fought by heroes alone. They're built by supply chains and quarterly earnings, and men who never see the blood but count the profits anyway. That bomber didn't crash from the sky, it fell from a boardroom. The legacy of this betrayal still shapes how we think about war and commerce. After World War II, America created stricter export controls, built oversight mechanisms meant to prevent strategic materials from reaching potential enemies. But those systems have loopholes, and corporations still find ways to prioritize profit over national interest. We've seen it with technology transfers to China, with military equipment ending up in the hands of terrorists, with dual-use goods that blur the line between commerce and complicity. The engineers who examined that crashed bomber understood something most people never want to face: that wars aren't clean narratives of good versus evil. They're messy human enterprises where the same hands that wave flags can also sign export contracts, where patriotism and greed exist in the same hearts, where young men die in machines built by the very society that sent them to war. Chen's report still exists somewhere in the National Archives, stamped and filed and forgotten by everyone except historians like me who can't let the past stay quiet. On the last page, in handwriting that suggests he added it after the official documentation was complete, he wrote a single sentence: "We built the enemy, then wondered why they looked so much like us." That's the truth that got buried. Not just that American parts powered Japanese planes, but that the system that allowed it never really got broken. It was working exactly as designed, just not for the men who had to face those planes in the sky, or pull their friends from burning ships, or die in jungles wondering why the enemy seemed so well equipped. The bomber in the rice paddy has long since been cut up for scrap or lost to rust and time. But the questions it raised, the betrayal it represented, those remain, waiting in archives and memories and the spaces between what we're told about war and what war actually is. Sometimes the enemy isn't just the man in the other uniform. Sometimes it's the shadow standing behind us, counting money while we count the dead.